I can't imagine anything better than a day on the Green River up here in Utah, below Flaming Gorge Dam. Already had a dozen fish to the dry and to the wet fly. Just a great day to be out. But you can't always be out here. So you can enjoy your sport vicariously, and one of the ways you can do that is through fly tying. And by golly, in this tape, we can teach you to tie excellent flies. It isn't that hard. Anybody can learn the technique, and I'll tell you that it's just about the next best thing to fishing itself. Because like I say, there's many a night as I sit at that vise and tie a hare's ear, maybe like this one, dream of that trout that I'm going to catch. Get out here on the river and actually to use a fly that you tied to catch fish that you found on the river is about as much fun as you can possibly have. That is something that's really special, and that's what we hope to be able to teach you on this tape.
Welcome to the Sportsman's Workshop, brought to you by Chevy Trucks. The trucks you can depend on, the trucks that last.
If you have as much outdoor gear as I do, you need the right transportation. A truck you can depend on, one that lasts. Like this all-new Chevy Suburban, or the sporty all-new full-size Blazer, ready to tackle just about any off-road terrain. Blazer has available seating for 6, and Suburban lets you choose seating packages for up to 9, or 160 cubic feet of cargo space. And talk about towing. This super wagon has increased towing capacity up to 5 tons. Blazer's towing ability is increased too, and both give you standard 4-wheel anti-lock brakes for even more security on the road. You know, folks, it's hard for me to think of vehicles that suit today's sportsmen and sportswomen better than this new Chevy Suburban and Blazer. There's just nothing else like them. And when you head for home, remember to pack out everything you brought with you, including spent shells and old fishing line, and set a good example for others.
Well, folks, it's always kind of the pits to leave the river and get back home, but I can recapture a lot of the excitement of being on the river and fishing by sitting at the vise and tying some flies. And I thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about what you're going to need to get into fly tying, some of the equipment, and maybe some of the books that you might need to get started. Now, I'm going to suggest that if you're serious about learning to tie flies, that the first thing you do is buy yourself a couple of books that are going to help a lot. And I think that a couple of them that I'd recommend are Jack Dennis's Fly Tying Manuals, and there's Volume 1 is probably for the beginner the one that you most would like to have. Volume 2 kind of carries on. The advantage of these books is that they have pictures inside that explain every step. In fly tying, it's pretty hard to understand exactly what you're supposed to do if you're not able to actually see somebody performing the tying itself, so that you understand how your hands perform, what the thread's supposed to do, and what the finished fly is supposed to look like. There's another book that has become a classic, and even though this was first printed in 1963, Helen Shaw's book on fly tying is still sort of the beginner's Bible, because it likewise carries you through all the steps that you'd need to learn to really be a proficient tyer and to do well. There's also a magazine that's put out with the fly tyer in mind called the American Fly Tyer, and it is now called the American Angler and Fly Tyer, and that might be a magazine you'd like to subscribe to. Many of the patterns are rather advanced, but at the same time it gives you some idea of what's happening in the world of fly tying. Now, since very few of the materials and equipment that a fly tyer uses until very recently was really made primarily with a fly tyer in mind, we like to scrounge a lot of the stuff we use, a lot of our materials, even our equipment. And something you'll find is that there's a lot of catalogs nowadays that you can get for free that have really nice fly assortments demonstrated in them for sale. So if you write off for some of the larger catalogs, you're going to find that you have pictures of the flies that very often you're going to want to be tying. And this gives you a really good idea of what the color is supposed to look like, what the configuration of the fly is. It makes it a lot easier to tie them, and it gives you a lot of ideas for good for good flies that you'd like to tie. So, like I say, those are things that you can get for free and don't cost you anything. Now, we should talk a little bit about the equipment that you're going to need, and we're not going to spend a lot of time with that, but your primary piece of equipment is going to be your vise. And a good quality vise is primary to good fly tying. The thing that's going to matter the most is whether the vise will hold a hook and not let that hook move in the vise. Will it hold the hook tight enough so that as you tie, you won't be pulling that hook up and down so that you're struggling to keep it in the vise. That's the one thing it's got to do. I think that the standard vise today is still the old Thompson Model A, and you can buy that vise for under $40. So you want a good quality vise, and like I say, you can spend up to $200 if you like to do that. But a Thompson Model A is going to do just about anything you want it to do. Secondarily, in order of importance, is going to be a good pair of hackle pliers. They're not particularly expensive, but you may go through several pairs before you find one that does what you want it to do, which is namely to be able to hold that hackle tightly, but not to cut that hackle or break it, and to be delicate with it. Another item that is absolutely necessary to good fly tying is going to be a really good pair of scissors. And what's going to determine whether or not they'll do the job for you is whether or not those scissors will cut right to the very tip. You're going to want a scissor that has a fairly large loop for your fingers, because tyers carry their scissors on the fourth finger of their hand. They do all of their tying with those scissors there. Those scissors never leave their hands. Everything else is done around the scissors until the scissors are needed. So they're grasped inside the hand with that ring on that fourth finger. So you want to make sure that your scissors will fit there. And it's going to make your tying a lot easier if you're able to do that. Last but not least, as far as the items that you have to tie flies, is a good quality bobbin. And this one by Monterelli, or one that's similar to that, is going to do the job for you. All it does is hold your thread, but it's constructed so that as you tie, it's held in your hand, and you can control the tension on these little wires on the side just by squeezing or releasing pressure. Sure makes your tying easier to have a good quality bobbin to work with, and once you get used to it, that's going to be something that feels very natural in your hand. Now, let's talk about some items that it might be nice to have, but you don't absolutely have to have. One of them is going to be a material clip. Shouldn't cost more than $1. Fits on your vise, and what that does is hold excess materials. When you tie 2 or 3 things on the hook at the same time, and you want to get one of those materials out of the way, all it does is hold that material out of your way. Simple little item that is worth its weight in gold, helps your tying to be a lot better than maybe what it was before. Another thing would be a whip finisher. You can finish by hand. You can use half hitches, but this whip finisher, this is a Thompson whip finisher, again, is an item that you might like to purchase, but it is not absolutely necessary to have. What they call a bodkin is nothing more than a needle on a shaft of some sort. This is something you can make yourself. How about just a needle in a piece of cork? And what it's used for is to pick out materials, but it's also used to just place a dab of cement on the head of a fly. But again, like I say, I think you could walk around your garage and find 5 or 10 items, or even your kitchen, that might suffice as a bodkin, or you might like I say, just to use a large needle in a cork, and that'll do the same job exactly. You might like to use a hair stacker. Some people use a shotgun shell for this particular part of fly tying, which is nothing more to even up the ends of deer or elk hair or other kinds of hair that you might be tying with. It's got a little barrel inside a little tube, and you drop the hair in there, and what it does basically is to even the tips of the hair up. Don't have to have one of these, and I'm sure, again, you could find something around the house that would suffice. Last but not least, you might like to have, you don't have to have, but you might like to have this little hackle master, and what it does is tell you what size hackle that is. So, when you're beginning and you're not sure what size hackle should go on a size 12 dry fly, as an example, this will tell you. Now, if you want to get into some real serious confusion, the matter of hooks will come up in fly tying. Basically, today there are hundreds of styles of hooks. There are quite a few companies that make hooks, and This, like I say, can be very confusing. If you read the manuals, you're going to come out with many, many different kinds of hooks that supposedly you need. How about making it really simple? And something I've tried to do is to use just a very few hooks and use them in the different sizes that you're going to need. So you'd be better off to have a lot of sizes of just 1 or 2 or 3 kinds of hooks than to have 50 or 60 kinds of hooks and not have very many sizes represented in any of them. What I've done is that I basically use a streamer or a nymph hook. A 79580 is the number that the mustad hook would be, and I have it in many sizes, and I can use that for woolly boogers, I can use it for nymphs, and I can use it for streamers. I have a dry fly hook that I can use, and this particular hook is the 94840, which is a standard dry fly hook. It can be also used for some wet flies. And we have a nymph hook, which is the 9671, which is a 3X long hook, and I use that as my standard nymph hook. And you can also use that for some long shank dry flies, but at the same time, like I said, if you have those 3 hooks, you can do 90% of the time that you need to do. So just because you read about a pattern that calls for some exotic hook, pick one of your hooks that's pretty close to that, and you're going to find it's going to do just fine. Now, we need to talk a little bit about rooster capes, or capes as they're called, or necks as some people refer to them as, but this is where you're most likely to spend most of your money in procuring materials, because what you want to tie with are these genetic capes. These birds are genetically raised for the purpose of fly tying, and they are just beautiful and easy to use, and they make fly tying a pleasure, and they make it very easy. Just a few words about selecting a cape. What you want to do is to begin with the primary colors, and the primary colors you might want would be to have a good quality brown cape and possibly a good quality grizzly cape, as they call this Plymouth Rock rooster. The first thing I would look at in a cape is to gently bend the cape and look at the points of those feathers and make sure that those points are intact. If a lot of them are chopped off, if those feathers are broken, then the quality is not going to be quite as good. Another thing that you might look at is just the sheen on the cape. If it's got a nice shiny surface to it, probably you have a good quality cape. And last but not least, you want to maybe take a look at some of the feathers, gently move one up where you can get a good look at it, and just bend it and look at the little barbules on that feather, and you can tell something about what sizes you're going to be able to tie with on this particular cape. And each one is going to be different. But depending on what your tying needs are, if mostly you're going to be tying flies between sizes, say 16 and 10 or so on a cape, then you want to see that that sweet spot has as many of those size feathers as possible. So that's going to be a cape you can use the most. Those are the things basically you look for. When you're starting out, it'd be a good idea to have somebody help you pick out some quality capes, and try to find capes, like I say, that are within your price range, but at the same time realize that buying really quality capes is going to make your fly tying a lot easier. Here's one of the flies that we want to demonstrate because it shows quite a few of the techniques that we want to use, and this is a black woolly booger. It could be tied in a variety of colors, but this is, like I say, one of the flies that we're going to be interested in tying, and shortly we're going to do just exactly that, now that we know what our materials are and also that we know what our equipment is that we're going to be using. Now, the wrong way to put the hook in the vise is to bury the point and the barb in the jaws of the vise, because what you've done effectively is put a lot of stress on that hook right at this point. And one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to weaken that hook, which is the worst possible situation because you think you have a sound hook. First good fish you hook, it's going to break right there. Or else, after you've tied your entire fly and spent 15 minutes doing a fine job of it, you're going to find that as you take that hook out of the vise, that it's going to have broken at that point. And you have a useless fly. So what you want to do is you want to mount that hook so that it's parallel to the table, nice and flat, and so that the barb and the point of the hook are actually out of the jaws of the vise right at that point, just like so. Now let's start this first fly. What we're going to do is we're going to use a thread, and this thread can be either a 6/0 pre-waxed black thread, or you could use a brown thread that's 3/0. The 3/0 being stronger than the 6/0. We're going to use the 6/0 pre-waxed thread here for this particular fly. When you start the thread onto the hook, you want to start up near the eye of the hook and just carry that thread across and over on top of itself, and that begins your thread. And now you're wrapping on top of the loose end, and you begin to just spiral down the hook. Now when you leave a layer of thread on the hook, what you've done is you've allowed a tackier surface for your materials so that they don't slide around on the hook. And that's why you should cover the hook in most cases with a layer of thread. When you get down toward the bend of the hook, now you don't want to go beyond the bend, we'll cut off that tag end and discard it, and always wrap away from you. That's one rule of fly tying, is that you always wrap over the hook and away from you, never under the hook and toward you. So everything's going in a single direction. Okay, now we have our thread on the hook. We've placed it properly, and we've covered most of the hook from up near the eye all the way down to the beginning of the bend. And in this particular case, since we want to keep everything on the top of the hook, on the flat part of the hook, we're going to stop just short of the bend. Now let's select a black marabou quill, which is going to be the tail for this fly. We'll just select a feather out of the bunch. And we'll take that, and now we have an entire quill there, which is far more than we need. We'll strip out what it looks like we're going to need. We'll keep that much, and we'll just snip that quill right at that point. This is a very breathable material, and one of the neat things about it, and you can see how it springs out, has the same tendency to do that in the water as you move it through the water, that material tends to breathe in and out like that. So that's going to be a nice material to put on that hook. Now, when you want to place a material on the hook, one thing I like to do is to take my right hand, if you're right-handed, and measure that tail more or less so that it looks right to your eye. A rule of thumb would be that the tail be about the length of the flat part of the shank of the hook. So we can kind of measure that there. There, now where my fingers are pinching that feather, we know that that's how long we want that tail to be. So we can transfer it right to the other hand very easily. And we're going to hold it in place while we tie it with the thread. Now, as you turn the thread over the top of the hook, there's going to be a tendency always to want to rotate the material away from you. You want to stop that tendency, and one way to accomplish that is to pinch the hook and the material in your fingers, and as you bring the thread up, do not turn loose. Bring the thread between your fingers. Note that the thread now is, we can release the tension. I've slid it between my fingers, and you don't have to release tension to do that. Come down under the hook, take another wrap up between clenched fingers, back down under the hook, pull just lightly to set that, and now you have a material that's going to be sitting right up on top of the hook where you want it to be. It's not going to rotate around the hook. So you can add a few more turns if you would like to just give this fly stability and give that tail good solid foundation. And now we can cut away the excess. And we're going to want to add one more material to that tail to make it look a little bit more attractive to the trout, and that's going to be some black crystal flash, and we'll prepare that material, and we'll put about 4 strands on each side. Whatever looks correct to your eye is going to be just fine. This picks up some highlights, and we're going to tie 4 strands on one side, and we can just hold it on the far side of the hook where we want it to be. Rotate over the top, and that's in place. We can cut it to length, same length as the tail. We can bring the other 4 strands around the other side, gather them, tie them in place, cut them to length, and that's our completed tail now. And like I say, we see the beginnings then of a fly that is a deadly fish catcher, not just a trout fly, but it's good for bass and northerns and quite a few other kinds of fish, depending on what sizes you tie them in. And you can tie them in extremely large sizes or you can tie them in fairly small sizes and they can be very effective. Now the next material that we're going to use is maybe something a little unorthodox, but we're going to show you a trick here that makes this a real sturdy fly. And that's we're going to take some fine gold wire, and we're going to lay that in the right angle that's formed by the bottom of the shank of the hook and the thread, and then with a loose wrap we're going to catch it right there, and we're going to tie that in place. We're going to take that and put it up on top of our material clip so it's held out of the way. And we're going to leave that there for the time being. But that gold wire is going to be your insurance that's going to build a nice sturdy fly. Now we want to build the body of the fly, which is built out of black chenille. In this particular case, we're using a material. Maybe you can catch the glint off the light in there. There's a fine silver wire inside this chenille. And I like things that pick up a little bit of a sparkle to them. Not real obvious, real subtle. But as that fly moves in the water, that fish is going to catch that glint off it, and it's just something that's going to attract them a little bit better. I always like that. So we're going to clip off a length of the chenille. One thing when you tie in chenille, you have a problem with it because it's a very bulky material. And if you tie that material in right there, you're going to end up with a ball on your fly right here. It's going to be thicker at that point as you start to wrap the body of your fly than it will be anyplace else because of the fact that that's where you tied it in. If you take your fingers, take your thumbnail and your forefinger and just pull on it, you expose the little rope that holds that chenille in place. Now you can just tie those little threads in and you're not going to build up any bulk. Again, I like to tie my materials in the same place. The L, or the 90-degree angle that is formed by the bottom of the shank of the hook and your hanging thread. I like to just lay that in there, a nice soft loop catches it, then you can start to tie tighter. And bring your thread now up again, spiraled toward the eye of the hook. Leave yourself room for a head and let your thread hang. And we're ready now to spiral the body on, and always again, tying away from you, we're going to begin to build the body of this fly. As I tie, I really enjoy kind of thinking about that fly, what it's doing in the water, why a fish is going to be interested in this fly. I guess because I'm kind of a meat and potatoes sort of a guy, I like a big fly like this that's going to move through the water, and I can just imagine that old trout laying down there and seeing this steak and potatoes flash past his face. And now that we've gotten up to the top of the eye of the hook, we can tie that off with a couple of turns of thread. And like I say, I can get excited just tying one of these flies and just thinking what it's going to do to an old brown trout someplace. And that starts to look pretty good to me. We've got now the body of that fly placed where we want it, and we've also noticed left enough room for a head on that fly. Too often when you're tying, one of the big problems the beginning tyers seem to have is always crowding the head of the fly. Leave yourself about a quarter of an inch in that area right there. You almost can't have too much room for an eye, or for a head, but it's very easy to not leave yourself any room at all. Now the next thing that we need is a nice long saddle hackle. This comes off the saddle of a rooster, and notice what a nice long black feather that is, and that's, like I say, going to add a lot to this fly. We're going to strip away this webby part toward the base, and by just again holding it between your thumb and your forefinger and pulling, you can expose the stem of that hackle. And we're going to tie that in, and we're going to tie it with the shiny side of the feather towards you. Now, the hackle has a shiny side and it has a dull side. And we're going to want to tie that with the shiny side toward us. And we will lay that hackle at a 45-degree angle from the far side of the hook across the top of the hook itself, light loop to catch it, tighter loops to hold it in place. Now we're ready to begin to hackle this fly. Very often, woolly worms, woolly boogers are hackled from the back to the front. Notice that we're going to be hackling this from the front to the back, and I'll show you why in a minute. So the first thing we want to do is take a couple of wraps of that hackle at the front. I like 2, just to give it a little bit more bulk there, and then we start to spiral that hackle down toward the tail of the fly, and that's called palmering the hackle. A palmered rib or a hackle is spiraled in this manner. When we get toward the tail of the fly, we're going to stop right there. We're going to pick up our gold wire, and we're going to begin wrapping it in a spiral back up the other way. And by weaving it through the hackles, you won't knock those hackles down. They'll escape, so you don't tie the hackle itself down. But what you're doing in essence is making sure that this hackle is bound to that hook in a way that there is no way it's going to come apart on you. The weakest part of this fly is going to be the stem of that hackle, and if a large fish hits that, his teeth will very often cut that hackle and ruin your fly. That's the end of the fly. This way, you could cut that hackle anywhere along the length of that hook, and still it would not unravel. Now we're going to take a couple of turns just to bind down that gold wire. We can clip away the gold wire itself, discard that. We've got the tag end of our hackle down at the bottom, and just snip that away, and we've discarded then the end of the hackle. Now we've got our fly all but finished. All we need is a head on that fly. We have a finished woolly booger. By using your first two fingers, your middle finger, your index finger, and your thumb to make a kind of a tripod, you can grab all of the hackle and pull it back out of the way so that you're not going to tie it down as you begin to wrap your head. You don't want too bulky a head. You want a nice tapered head on this fly, on most flies that you tie. And so we'll begin to build that. Once we've accomplished that, now we want to tie that off. And there's a variety of ways that we can do that. And we'll demonstrate one way, which is using a hand whip finish. Take on your right hand, your middle and your index fingers, come across the back of your finger with the thread. With your bobbin hand, move toward the tail so that you've wrapped that thread around your fingers, then twist so that you cross the thread over itself and pull that up against the head of the fly. Now your thumb is up, you have your index finger on top, your middle finger on the bottom. Go to the back side of the hook and twist. Roll under, thumbs up, index finger on top, middle finger on the bottom. Go to the back side of the hook, twist. Roll under, do that same thing again several times. Then, holding that thread up, that loop, take your scissors or any instrument in that and slowly begin to pull that closed with your bobbin hand and let it go. And now you have a whip finish that's not going to turn loose. That will stay there forever. You don't even really need head cement if you choose not to use it. In this particular case, we are going to use some head cement to bind everything down. We'll take our bodkin, and I like to just dip the tip of that into that cement so that we don't get it gobbed up everywhere. Place that over the head and just let that soak in. A good cement's going to just be absorbed right into those threads. One of the problems you're going to occasionally have, other than spilling a bottle of head cement on your wife's new rug, is going to be that you find that you get cement into the eye of the fly. And if that happens, you're going to spend precious time when you're fishing trying to unclog that and find something to unclog it with. So a little trick that helps a bunch is to just take an old hackle, any old hackle will do, expose some of the stem, and then just place that through the eye and run that through there, and those barbules off that feather will just absorb that cement and clean that eye just slick as a whistle. And that feather will last quite a while, so you can do that several times. I like to speculate on what kind of a fish I'm going to get on that fly. Every time I sit down to tie, I think of what this fly is going to do, what that fly is going to do, where I'm going to fish it, what big trout's going to take it. And that's part of the excitement of my fishing to me, and I can make it last all through a long winter's night. So this is something that I hope you enjoy as much as I do. But that's a good fly for lots of occasions. Gold-ribbed hare's ear goes back hundreds of years and is sure a fine pattern that has taken many, many a fish in many a place. And I like to weight my nymphs, most of them anyway. And this particular one will use just a light fuse wire. And the way I like to weight them is to just begin to roll that right around the hook. just any old way, spirals on there, and you can count how many wraps you like, 5 or 6, something like that. You can pull that off there using your thumbnails. You can get that fuse wire laid on there nice and smooth until you have it where you want it. Now, I like to put it up in the thorax region of the fly, which is the top 2/3 toward the eye. To keep it there, I'll take my tying thread and take a couple of wraps in front of, then crisscross right to the back of that wire and wrap it back there, and this is going to hold it in place, and you can pretty well position it. Then I'm going to take just a few wraps over the top of it, crisscrossing backwards and forwards to make sure that that wire is going to stay just exactly where I put it, and build a little ramp up onto that wire so that you have a fairly smooth transition as you tie around that, and you don't have that big lump. And I can go back toward the where we're going to tie in the tail of the fly, and again we're going to stop just short of the bend of the hook. For the tail on my hare's ear, I like to use bronze mallard. There's about 6 feathers on each side of each mallard, and they come off the mallard drake right about where the armpit would be. And I find that this barred bronze-colored feather is just a nice color for what I think that nymph ought to look like. Again, we're going to measure that tail, and that tail should be more or less the length of the flat part of the shank of the hook. And we're going to tie that in at that point, keeping that material right up on top where we want it. We can clip off our excess. Now we're going to tie in a gold tinsel, part of the name of that fly, the gold-ribbed hare's ear. And we're going to tie that in. And I'm going to tie that almost as far up as the lead so that we get a nice transition. And again, we don't have any points at which we fall off something we've tied in. We'll put that into our material clip to hold it there. And we're going to dub on some hare's mask. This material actually does come off the face, if you would, of an English hare. And it's kind of a rough fur. And we just dub it onto the thread. And we do that dubbing, by the way, by taking small bunches of fur and turning them in one direction only onto the thread. You can actually make a little yarn out of that. And as we do that, you can build it up so that you have it more or less in a cigar shape so that it's a little thicker in the middle than it is toward the end. Now we've built that little yarn onto our thread, and we can wrap that on as the body of the fly. And that body is going to extend about 2/3 of the way up toward the eye of the hook, more or less, little less maybe, but now we've got a nice tapered body, as you can see. Now we're going to take our gold tinsel, and we are going to begin to spiral that through the body in about 4 or 5 nice even spirals, like so, and we're going to tie that off right where the body ends. A couple of turns is sufficient, and we can just clip that away. Now the next thing that we're going to tie in is going to be our mottled turkey quill, which is going to form our wing case. By the way, you can make these quills much more manageable if you give them a spraying before you start and let them dry real good of Crumbacker's Tough Film. Now this is an art spray, and you can get it in any art shop, and for a fly tire it should last about 10 or 15 years. But like I say, it's well worth taking your quills and spraying them with this. It makes them hold up much, much better, and they're more manageable to tie with. And we're going to just use a section, that's about 1/4 of an inch wide, maybe a little less, more like 1/8, and pull that apart. And that's going to be our wing case, and we are going to clip that so the edge is nice and flat. We're going to tie it in on top of the hook with the shiny side up, and we'll tie that right in there. Now tie back onto the body of the fly that you've already tied just a little bit so that you have a nice clean transition onto what now will be the thorax of the fly. Again, we'll take our dubbing, and using small bits, small works better than big in this particular case, rolling it in one direction. You can move it up the thread into place. Again, another little bit, and we'll keep adding until we have enough fur on there so that we can form the thorax, or the chest part, if you would, of this fly. And now we have what we need. We're going to roll that right in place. Now it's going to be a little thicker than the body is. And once we get that in place where we want it, we'll take our thread up to where the head is going to be. And again, leave yourself plenty of room for the head. Now we're going to take the wing case, which is shiny side up, and we're going to fold it over. And now the dull side is up, but a lot more mottled side and a pretty color to show. And we're going to cover the top of that like so. Now we can tie that in place, and that's the beginning of our head. And we will slide our scissors right under the eye of the fly and clip away the excess quill, and now we'll tie the head off. In this particular case, if you like, you can do a half hitch. Now we can take a half hitch tool, but you could just as easily, by the way, use the barrel of a ballpoint pen. That works very nicely. You could make your own half hitch tool out of that. Take a twist of the thread and just place the barrel over the top, slip it off, and you can half hitch that way. And a half hitch will hold that head nicely, especially if you plan to use a little bit of head cement with that. We'll clip away our thread. We'll add just a drop of head cement. And that's our completed gold-ribbed hare's ear. There are many, many nymphs that you can buy, that you can tie, that you can use. Most of them are tied in pretty much the same manner this one is. Now let's try a really classic dry fly of the old Adams. We'll take an old grizzly hen cape with nice webby feathers, and we're going to use those for the wings. And those wings we will put shiny side against shiny side so that they are convex to convex and that they tend to naturally point away from each other. The easiest way for me to get my proportions right is to take those feathers and measure them against, again, the length of the shaft of the hook, the straight part of the top of the hook. And I like them just a little bit longer than that. I like kind of a long wing on my dry flies. And once I have the proportions where I want them, I will shift those to my other hand because I like to stand mine up from the eye toward the hook. Now note that I have the thread at about the 2/3 mark from the bend toward the eye. And I like to tie my wings in first, because if you're going to mess this fly up, this is where you're going to do it. So why not put the wings in first? If the fly doesn't turn out, you can cut them off and start all over again rather than tie the whole fly and find out it isn't going to work for you. Now again, I'm going to grab the shaft, holding the feathers, and I have everything now in my control. My fingers, if you can see my fingertips, are kind of blanched. I'll bring the thread up between my fingertips, down very lightly, just to bring the feather right down on top of the hook. One more time, nice and light. And now I've got some control over those feathers, and I can begin to wrap them onto the hook. I can make any adjustment I want in length. If I want them a little longer or a little shorter, I can adjust that. They're still in my control. Now I'm going to take those feathers, I'm going to lift them up, and we're going to build a little ramp right at the back, right up against the base of that feather, just to make it stand up for us. Once we've got it standing up, I'm going to take my scissors, we're going to clip off those butts. Now, to keep those feathers separated so that we have a nice separated wing, we're going to take a very loose figure 8 wrap between those feathers, not tight, nice and light, and then wrap forward tighter and tighter. And we've got our wings right where we want them to be. One thing you want to remember, so long as you have the thread only on top of a material that you're tying and you have not progressed from the material onto the body of the hook, onto the bare steel of the hook, that material can still be moved. If I'm not happy with the position of those wings, I can still, if I use my fingernails, I can still slide that wing backwards and forwards. So I can get that position exactly where I want it. As soon as I begin to wrap onto the steel of the hook, I have anchored that material at that point and it'll no longer move. So you might remember that with any material. You can anchor it that way. Now for the tail of this fly, I'm going to use a little bit different wrinkle. Normally speaking, this pattern calls for a grizzly hackle and a brown hackle, a kind of a salt and pepper mix. But there's another feather that you can use, and this feather is called a cree. And you will note that it's actually a 3-colored feather. And I like to use this for my Adams. It makes a slightly lighter fly, but is still effective in its kind of salt and pepper material. So that's what I'm going to use for the tail and for the hackle of this fly. It's a little bit cheaper feather for one thing, and it's just as effective, and it's easy to use. So I'm going to take a single feather from that cree neck, and I'm going to take out just enough of the barbules to make the tail. And what I will do is that I will pull those straight out on the stem, and then I will just pull down the feather, and it'll take them right off for me. And they should be in a nice even bunch, so that I have a nice even bunch of material to use for the tail. Don't underestimate in a dry fly the importance of the tail of the fly. That other than the hackle is the most important part of a dry fly if it's to float properly. It floats on its tail and on its hackle. Now, I'm going to take that material, and I want my tail to be as long, again, as the shank of the hook. That makes such a nice measuring point for so many proportions. So I want the tail to be the length of the shank of the hook, plus I want the distance from the bend to where the wing wraps leave off. I don't want any gaps in between, so I want to add that much onto the tail, and I can measure it right against the hook, and then I can cut it right at that point. And I now have a tail that is the right length, including the distance up the shank of the hook, so that I don't have any hard transition, a drop off, if you would, from the wraps on the wings to the wraps on the tail. And I'm going to lay that tail material in there right up against the butts of the wing and start taking some loose wraps so I catch that material, keep it on top. If you lift that material off the shank and use the thread to pull it down onto the top of the hook, it will never roll away from you. It'll stay right up on top. So lift just gently and let the thread pull the material down onto the hook. Now we don't want to go around the bend of the hook. We want to keep on the flat part of the hook. And now we have the right size tail, the right length, and it's standing straight out from the hook along the top of the hook. It hasn't rolled over on the side. And if you look at flies very often, you'll note that especially the tails have rolled away with the thread. Pressure of the thread has pushed that material around the hook. This, by lifting that tail and letting the pressure of the thread pull it onto the top of the hook, makes a nice, neat tail that's right exactly where you want it to be. Now we want to tie a body, and we use muskrat fur as a dubbing. We can take that, and again, this is a very fine-bodied fur. Just take little bits, and again, spinning in one direction with your thumb and forefinger, begin to apply it to the thread. And if you use a pre-waxed thread, which is really advisable, you'll find that this dubs very easily on there. But remember, not backwards and forwards, just one direction, one direction. And try not to put any more dubbing on there than you actually need. And if you find that you have too much dubbing on there, you can always take it off. You don't have to use every little bit that you put on. You want to start with a fine amount and then start to let it build up so that you get a tapered body up toward the wings. And you don't want to go clear onto the wings. Remember that you have a hackle to put in there, so stop short. Now notice we have a nice tapered body there, but we still have dubbing left over. Well, there's no rule that says you have to use all of that dubbing. Again, just pinch that thread and pull down, and you can take that dubbing right off that thread. So what you don't need, don't use. Just because it's on there, some people try to force that material onto the hook. What you don't need, don't use. Take a little twist right up against the body. Now we have the right length that we want. We have a nice tapered body. That's coming out just the way we want it to. Boy, I can just see that thing floating down over a nice big brown trout. His looking up and seeing that fly. Boy. Now, since we're kind of bastardizing this particular Adams and we're changing it a little bit, we've selected 2 Cree hackles, 3 colored hackles actually, and the Cree, like I say, has the colors that we want. We've selected the right size, and we're going to take those. I'm going to use 2 of them to hackle this fly. It's a fairly large fly. I like to take and just tear away any web toward the bottom of the fly, get rid of that, keep the best part of that hackle, clip it off so that we leave some clean butts to work against. And you can kind of see now that we have these butts to work with and to tie onto the fly. We are going to tie those hackles on, laying them at a 45-degree angle, more or less across the hook, in front of the wing, toward the tail side of the wing, and with the shiny side of the hackle toward us. That's very important. We're going to take several wraps. We'll go behind the wing, and we'll tie those butts down, and we'll give ourselves a nice little ramp to work again. And again, do not crowd the eye of the hook. Okay, we've placed our hackles just exactly where we want them to be. We'll take our hackle pliers, and we're going to engage the first of those hackles, and I'm going to take 3 nice even wraps. If we can get this hackle pliers to do what we want it to do. We're going to take 3 even wraps to the tail side of that fly. Then we'll just run right under and behind that wing and up tight against the wing. We're going to take 3 more wraps. And then we're going to just crisscross the hackle and the thread. Now you can turn loose of the hackle and it'll hang on the thread, and take 1 or at most 2 wraps. Then cut away that hackle. Be careful not to cut away your thread. This is a perfect time to cut away your thread, and then you really have to go back and start over again. Now with that second hackle, just begin a slight weaving motion and just run through that first hackle. And that little weaving motion will keep you from binding down the first hackle. Go right behind those wings, just as tight as you can. Just weave your way right in there. And give it 3 turns in front, 3 turns behind. Cross your thread behind your hackle and come over the top with the thread. And you've tied that hackle in. And now we can cut that away. Again, be careful not to cut away your thread. And we're ready for a head on this fly. And again, for a dry fly, keep a nice, discreet little head. Don't make it too big. And this time we're going to use a Thompson whip finisher. Now I'm not going to really demonstrate how this is used precisely, because if you get one, full instructions will come with this instrument. But you will find that one of the advantages of this is that it leaves one hand free to pull the hackle and the wings out of the way while you do this whip finish. So you may want to use an instrument to whip finish. You may want to use a whip finisher. And once we get everything where we want it, we can clip away that thread. If we have any wild little renegades in there that we don't want, we can trim that up. Make sure that our wings are cocked the way we want. And that's one of the nice things about tying your own flies. I like my wings on my dry flies just a little bit longer than the average might be, a little bit longer than the hackle. And so I can tie them that way. That's what looks right to my eye. And boy, as I sit here looking at this fly, this came out rather nicely. I just think to myself, I can't help but feel a little sorry for old Mr. Trout. Boy, this year, if I don't get him, I'd be real surprised. This looks like a fly that they're going to have no luck resisting. Throwing this fly on the water is going to be like rolling a wine bottle on a jailhouse floor. They're not going to be able to leave it alone for sure.
If you're gonna go hunting and fishing, you know your Ford just may not do. You need a Chevy to get you out there and to bring you home when you're through. If you're gonna spend time fishing or hunting off deep in the woods, I wouldn't put keys in the ignition unless there's a Chevy underneath that hood. Cause my Chevy is built for the highways and built for the backcountry. It'll get you out on the byways and home as easy as a 1, 2, 3. If you're gonna tame the wild frontier, your Ford just may not do. You need a Chevy to get you out there and to bring you home when you're through. The heartbeat of America, today's truck is Chevrolet.
Now I'm going to show you how to recoup your investment in this video 5 times over with a blender and this happens to be a little coffee blender, but you can use a regular kitchen blender, to make your own dubbing. Now, the first thing you do is that you carry a plastic bag in your car every place you go. And one of the things you do is in the wintertime, preferably in the wintertime, pick up roadkill. Just about any little animal you find run over in the road, if you do the tail test, pick it up by the tail, and if the body doesn't fall off, you're going to be able to probably use that skin on that animal. You can take that, put in that plastic bag, take it home with you, skin out part of it, and you can come up with some pretty nice furs to make your own dubbing. Now, grant you that a packet of dubbing only costs probably about $1, and you can buy quite a few of those and different kinds of furs that you would like to use, but it's kind of nice to find your own furs, tie your flies from, and so like I say, I'm kind of famous for picking up roadkills. If I see something I particularly like, I jump out of the car and grab that sucker. Bring it back, and once you do have a piece of fur, now this fur can, it can be roadkill, like I say, or if you want, you can go down to your local furrier or even your taxidermist, and for a few bucks, they'll give you their bits and pieces that they can't use, and any tiny little piece is something that a fly tire can certainly use. Just clip off bits of that fur from the skin with your scissors, as much as you want. And like I say, you can use any kind of a blender that you want to blend. And once you have a nice little stack, just start dropping in small amounts of fur into your blender. And you'll create a bit of a mess. This stuff likes to stick on things. And if you're using a kitchen blender, put it on a fairly low setting and then turn it on and off in short bursts, just like that. And that will start to spin that fur around in there. And very quickly it'll create almost what is a cotton candy of fur, which has now been mixed all together. You can even mix colors if you like to get your own colors. Then take it and begin to just pat it down into a patty. You can put it in your finger and kind of in your hand and just start to roll it around. And before very long, you will have enough so that, like I say, you can tie quite a few flies out of the different kinds. And I repeat, you can blend all the different kinds of furs that you want for different consistencies and or for colors. Then you can store that. I like to store mine in these little stackable units so that I have the different colors that I want. And many of these, like I say, are materials that I've put together myself. On the subject of a blender, if you're not too careful about cleaning out that blender when you're done with it, you're going to find that the first time that your wife decides to make a vanilla shake in that blender and it comes up full of hairs that she very quickly ascertains came from the last roadkill you picked up, at that point you've inherited a blender probably worth $30 or $40, plus you've saved money on your dubbing materials. So like I say, very quickly you'll find yourself building a nice little tier of tools that you can use and instruments, as well as having materials that didn't cost you anything to procure. Now, if you practice, rather quickly you're going to progress to more exotic and difficult patterns, like this bass bug that's tied predominantly from deer and elk hair, or you might be tying a hopper pattern such as this, which is again tied predominantly from deer and elk hair. And what I want to do is to show you a few techniques that if you just are willing to practice these, are going to help you very quickly learn to tie with the deer and elk hair. Deer and elk hair is a material that a lot of people have some difficulty with. They feel that it's very difficult to tie. And it can be difficult mainly because being a hollow hair, it tends to have some properties that are unique to itself. It tends to flare when you tie it down onto a hook, but you can use that to your advantage. So let's show you the technique for number 1, flaring hair, number 2, for rolling hair around the hook, and number 3, let's talk a little bit about keeping hair from flaring when you want it to stay static, for instance, when you're using it as a tail material. So let's start our thread on our hook. And again, we're going to use this strictly as a practice technique. We're going to take some deer hair. Let me show you a technique for either flaring elk or deer hair or for spinning it on a hook. And once you finish, how to lock it into place. Now, one of the things you want to do is clear out any underfur that might be in that hair. Very often there's quite a bit of it. You might even use a small comb to remove that under fur before you wrap it on the hook. Once you've cleaned it fairly well, if necessary, you can even up the tips with a hair stacker. In this case, for demonstration purposes, it won't be necessary. We're going to take that hair now, and what we're going to do is to flare it, but we're going to keep it in one spot on that hook. And the way you accomplish that is to carry that material to the hook, slide your fingers over the hook, and now I've locked my fingers and the material in the position where I want that hair to be. And I'm going to take my thread, I'm going to go up between my fingers, tight fingers, just slide your thread right into place, a loose wrap, a second wrap in the same spot, and now pull straight down and watch that hair begin to flare. Now, if you have a pretty good hold on it, you're going to find that you can keep that hair predominantly, we'll take another wrap in there, you can keep that hair predominantly to the top of the hook. Some of it has slid to the underside, but most of it, predominantly, you've kept the hair exactly where you want it on the hook. The whole secret to tying with hair is to be able to control it. So this is flaring hair, and like I say, what we want to do is keep that predominantly in the spot that we put it in. And you need to practice that until you're able to keep that hair in the position you want to put it in. Now let's take that hair off, and let's just take the ends, and let's keep those and cut the rest of that off. And now let's spin some deer hair. I like to take that hair and lay it across the hook at about a 45-degree angle, about like so. And I like to take a loose wrap, then a second wrap, and then let go of the hair and begin to roll it. And you will see that it'll roll its way around the hook until pretty soon it has covered most of the hook and it's flared right around the hook. Before you carve this, you're probably going to want to put several batches of hair on there. You may even want to use different colors of hair. So what you're going to do at this point is to stand that hair up. And this is an important little technique to really get your hair nice and tight. Pull it back out of the way, slide your thread to the front, and take 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 concentric wraps, one in front of the other, onto the bare shank of the hook, and then taking your fingernails of your middle finger and your thumb, slide it along the shank and push that hair back. Push those wraps right back into that hair real tight. Once you do that, you'll see that that hair stands almost straight up. It's totally out of your way. Now you can take a second bunch of hair if you would like to get a different color in there so that you can start getting different colors into play. You can clean out that hair. Clip off the ends that you're not going to need. Now we're going to lay those in there at about a 45-degree angle, right in front of the ones we just tied. Take a soft wrap, a second wrap, begin to let go of the hair and let it begin to flare into place, wrapping fairly tightly. You want to use a 3/0 thread usually, or a nylon thread, which is strong so that you can pull tight on it. Again, you can pull that hair back out of the way, or you can use a half-hitch tool if the barrel lets you slide up in there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 concentric wraps. Use your 2 nails, middle and thumbnail. Push with your left hand back against your right hand and stack that hair tight in there. The tighter the better, and it'll make that hair stand straight up just like it is. If you want to lock hair onto the hook, you have to get off of the hair and get onto the bare shank of the hook, and then you can lock everything in place so that it doesn't rotate at that point. You have a pretty tight body there. What you can accomplish by using different colors of hair is the variegated look, like this particular fly has as an example, where we have 3 different colors in here. You take a minnow or a sculpin that lives on the bottom of a river or a lake, very often they have different colors along their back especially, which make them better camouflaged and harder to see. I think at this point you have enough technique that you can practice, that you can tie some flies, and I think it's time for us to adjourn to the river and give some of these patterns a try.